Hi, welcome back to Traben's Tomes. In this episode, we'll be looking at the allusions to Japanese folklore found in Six Crimson Cranes. The concept of an allusion is something that my students often struggle with. An allusion is a reference to another work, whether it is a historical event or another piece of literature. Some of the most common allusions are to Greek or Roman myth or to the Bible, because those are stories that most people are familiar with. Someone says that a character has Herculean strength, or they call the ship that's leaving Earth the Ark. You understand those references very quickly, and it adds an extra layer to the storytelling happening in the moment. It forms the backbone of all these reimaginings and reinterpretations of classic fairy tale stories and folklore. So in titles like Marissa Mayer's Lunar Chronicles series, part of the enjoyment in these books is seeing how these classic fairy tales are reimagined into a new world, in this case, a futuristic Earth war with Luna, the moon. Understanding those allusions enriches our enjoyment of these titles. The interesting thing about Six Crimson Cranes is it's making a number of allusions to Japanese folklore, but these might not be stories that you're very familiar with. So in this video, I thought we'd take a moment to look at some of the inspiration behind the events in Six Crimson Cranes and hopefully enrich your understanding of what's going on in the story by explaining the twists it's making to these classic stories. This is not going to be a review. This is going to be a look at the elements in Six Crimson Cranes and the way those tie in with the classic stories. There will likely be spoilers in this video. I'm not going to try to censor myself the way I usually do when giving a book rating or doing a review on a book. So just go into it knowing that we're taking a little bit deeper dive. We're looking at a particular element in the story, and that might entail giving away certain plot points. You wish to speak? My stepmother's yellow eyes glowed. Then be wary of what you say, for so long as this bowl rests on your head, with every sound that passes your lips, one of your brothers shall die. We'll start with what is probably the most obvious from the title, but probably the most changed structurally for the story in the Crane Wife or the Crane Maiden. Like most folklore stories, there are a number of variations in the different tellings of the Crane Wife, but they share a couple of common features. The story begins with a farmer rescuing a crane who has been shot with an arrow and then heading back home after it has flown off. Sometime later, a maiden arrives. Depending on the story, that maiden is either adopted into the family if the main character is an older man, or is later married by the character, in the case of the Crane Wife. In any case, the woman eventually offers to weave a bolt of cloth, but they have a stipulation that while they're working, no one can look in on them. And the protagonist readily agrees. The maiden locks herself into a room and works on the loom, appearing later with a bolt of cloth that is stunningly beautiful, that the protagonist then sells at market for a high price. Depending on the iteration, the protagonist will then demand another cloth because they have become greedy, or they'll run out of money again, and once again the maiden will offer to weave another cloth but remind them not to look in. And this continues a number of times until finally, with the villagers kind of egging on the protagonist, he takes a look and it's revealed that the maiden was actually the crane that he rescued, and she is creating these cloths by plucking feathers from her own body. Having broken the promise of not looking at her while she works, the crane sadly leaves, and the old man or the young man is once again left alone, regretting their choice to look in on her as she was working. From the title Six Crimson Cranes, this seems like it would have the strongest connection with the story itself, but the way that the events unfold in Six Crimson Cranes is markedly different from any version of the Crane wife. There is the transformation into cranes of Shiori's brothers, but this is quite a departure from the folklore story. It does carry over an element that's very common to Japanese folklore in general, though, in that there is a promise that is in some way binding, both in The Crane Wife and in a story of Yuki Onna, the Snow Maiden. The ending of the story occurs when a character breaks a promise and then is punished by having the titular character leave them forever because they broke their word, they broke their oath. In Six Crimson Cranes, Shiori is not bound to a promise, but she is bound by magic to have one of her brothers die for every word that she speaks. So there's a lot of departure here from the source material, but you can still see some connective tissue in that if Shiori breaks this bond, then one of the cranes, one of her brothers, will leave forever. He will die. And this is not something that is a direct reference. I still feel like there is some inspiration there. There is some tie there between Six Crimson Cranes and the Crane Maiden or the Crane Wife. She set the bowl upon my head. As the wooden sides fell over my eyes and nose, I opened my mouth to scream, but her curse arrived faster than my voice, and a world of blackness folded upon me. Moving on to something with a much stronger connection to the events in Six Crimson Cranes, we have Lily and the Wooden Bowl. In this story, a wooden bowl is put on Lily's head. I believe her grandmother passes away or her mother passes away, and she's asked to keep it on her head to protect her modesty. And it's one of these very traditional stories where there's some characters who hate her because she's weird and she has this bowl on her head and they want to get it off of her head. And then you have a prince who is taken by her, a lord who's taken by her, and who eventually proposes to marry her. You've got an evil stepmother type situation where she has to prepare enough rice for the wedding reception from a single grain of rice, and she magically is able to do it with one of the items given to her by her grandmother. Evil stepmother has some sort of magical power where she can summon rats, so she's some sort of witch. And then at the end, once the couple gets married, the bowl shatters, becomes beautiful petals and jewels and sapphires, but the most beautiful thing of all, of course, is Lily's face. Elements taken from here are obviously the wooden bowl being affixed to Lily's head. In Six Crimson Cranes, Shiori has a bowl magically attached to her head, seemingly as punishment at the beginning, but you find out later it is for her protection, in a very similar way to what this story is trying to espouse. There's also, in some versions of the story, including the one I'm holding here, a folded crane that protects Lily when some of the men get a little bit more aggressive toward her. It flies out and like flitters around them. And once again, Shiori has a magic talent that is to bring these inanimate objects to life, and one of the primary things she has is a paper crane that protects her from others and can spy for her and do those types of things. This is another title where we're clearly taking some visual elements from it and using them to bring the story forward, right? That we're using these elements as things that those familiar with Japanese folklore would grab onto immediately and have that recognition. But I had failed the test because my pot had bloomed with orchids. They'd been purple, the same color as the expensive dyes merchants sent us for our winter robes, vibrant as a splash of twilight. I remembered being surprised and delighted by how beautifully they had grown. I should have questioned how they blossomed so quickly. and how the flowers had taken on exactly the color and shape I imagined. I now know it was because of my magic. The next allusion I want to talk about is from a very specific scene. Now, this is the empty pot, and the scene in question is one which sees Shiori receiving a pot from a local lord, and it being a test. The seed inside of it was dead, was cooked, I believe, and it still grows because of her magical powers. And so she fails the test because everyone thinks that she cheated. This is an inversion of the story of the empty pot, which sees a child who loves growing flowers, loves nature, loves working in the garden, and the local lord gives everybody a pot with a seed in it and tells them whoever grows the most beautiful flower will inherit the land. I think it might be the emperor actually in this story. And so like the emperor is determining the ruler of all of Japan from who can grow the most beautiful flower. And try as he might, the main character in here can't get the flower to grow, can't get the plant to grow, tries to change it into another pot, tries to do all these different things, change the soil, and none of it works. And they still show up on the day of the competition, and everybody else has all these beautiful flowers. And then it's revealed by the emperor that actually no, all of them were dead, all of them were fake, and nothing should have grown. And so all the other people cheated, and because of their honesty, the child inherits all of the kingdom. So again, an inversion of the story in which Shiori, because she is magic, is assumed to be a cheater, whereas all of her brothers, of course, they all succeeded in the task because they were honest and didn't cheat. Seiryu extended his hand, claws uncurling. Hold your breath. Saltwater stings on the nose, or so I'm told. I took one last glance at Taka and my brothers. My heart was with them, no matter where I went, no matter how different things would be when I returned. I held my breath. It would be the last one I'd take for a long while. Then, hand in hand with the dragon, I leapt into the Taijin Sea. The last illusion I want to discuss is probably one that's more suited for the sequel to Six Crimson Cranes, which is The Dragon's Promise. I've not read it yet, but I have a suspicion, given how the story ends, that this is going to be a take on Urashima Taro. So Urashima Taro is probably one of the most common folklore stories you'd find in a Japanese folklore collection. And in it, Urashima, the titular character, rescues a turtle from being harassed by these other young boys on the beach, is then rewarded by the dragon emperor, the dragon princess, to come down to the dragon kingdom below the sea and basically party with them for as long as he wants. And he goes down and has a great time. They party, they drink, they have just all these kind of crazy, wild adventures. And then eventually he comes back to his village, but it's changed. He goes back to his home, and his home is dilapidated. He asks about who lives in the home, and people say, oh yeah, someone used to live there, but now they're long gone. And he realizes that time has passed differently in the Dragon King's palace, and now everything around him is much older. Everyone he has known or loved is dead. Upon leaving the Dragon King's palace, the princess had given him a red box, and she's told him not to open it. And of course, in the throes of despair, for whatever reason, Urashima decides to open this red box, and a mist pops up and immediately turns him super old. So this is kind of a take on a Rip Van Winkle type story, the Japanese take on that story. And it's one that at the very end of Six Crimson Cranes, we get a taste of that occurring. And I imagine that The Dragon's Promise, the sequel book, will deal a lot more with those types of elements. I hope you enjoyed this dive into the Japanese folklore that inspired some of the elements of Six Crimson Cranes. If you'd like to dive deeper into this type of storytelling, I'd recommend picking up Tales of Japan, or the Japanese children's favorite stories, which contains some of the tales that I talked about today. You can also check out The Empty Pot by Demi, Lily in the Wooden Bowl by Alan Schroeder, or The Crane Maiden by Miyoko Matsutani. You may also be interested in picking up Never Open It by Ken Nimura. This is a retelling of 3 classic folklore tales in a very stark style that makes an excellent use of a limited color palette. I would maybe not recommend this as the first thing you pick up. I would recommend looking at iterations of the classic fairy tales first. But if you're already familiar with some of these Japanese tales, this has some interesting and fun spins on 3 of those stories, including Urashima Taro and The Crane Maiden. Allusion is a very powerful tool, but it's lost on an audience that is unfamiliar with the tales being alluded to. It was my hope that by exploring some of these stories behind the events in Six Crimson Cranes, it would enrich your understanding and your appreciation of the storytelling. Six Crimson Cranes is a beautiful book, building off of previous stories, and changing these elements can lead to excellent new stories being told on the shoulders of stories in the past. Sound off in the comments below letting me know how you felt about this video. Is this something you'd like to see me do more of in the future? Looking at different techniques that authors are using and going into a bit more of the analytical side of book reading. Let me know, what are your favorite adaptations or reinterpretations of classic fairy tales? Perhaps you've read Lunar Chronicles or some of the twisted tales that Disney puts out. These types of reimaginings are very fun for me to read. I'm always interested in acquiring new and interesting titles, so please let me know some of your favorites down below. And I hope you have an excellent day.